Welcome. My name is Stephen Wade. I'm the Health Equity Project Manager for the Virginia Department of Social Services. Today we're going to learn about worker self-care and secondary trauma. We want to do all we can to build up your resiliency and your strength. Working at the intersection of child welfare and substance use disorder is hard. It's very hard. And so it's critical that we learn about the skills and practices that you and your teams can adapt to be as strong, as resilient as you need to be. Thanks for being here today. Today we're going to cover a number of topics and issues related to worker self-care and secondary trauma. We're going to define secondary trauma, what it means for you and your teams. We're going to talk about prevention and how to intervene if someone on your team is experiencing secondary trauma or if you are experiencing secondary trauma. We're going to talk about trauma-informed self-care, what that means, how to make it active on your team. And we're going to provide guidance for supervisors on how to work with their teams around self-care. Secondary trauma is a result of one's exposure to someone else's trauma. The more often you are exposed to someone else's trauma, the more likely you are to experience secondary trauma. Symptoms can mirror those of post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. Things like avoidance, arousal, negative thoughts, intrusion, fear, chronic fatigue, guilt, hopelessness, anger or cynicism, sleeplessness. These are all things that we felt through our tough days with DSS. Secondary trauma and compassion fatigue take a toll on team and individual performance. Let's talk about who is at risk for secondary trauma. Child welfare workers are particularly at risk for secondary trauma. Really, any professional working with a traumatized population, including therapists, are at risk for secondary trauma. Women are at a greater risk of secondary trauma. Individuals, like many of us who work at DSS and display a higher sense of empathy, are at a greater risk for secondary trauma. Many of us at DSS have characteristics that could make experiencing secondary trauma or compassion fatigue more likely. We may have a personal history of trauma. We may have fewer years of professional experience. We might be younger. We know we all have heavy workloads. Our salaries could be low, or we might not have enough supervisory support. All of these things are characteristics that could make us higher risk for experiencing secondary trauma. Now let's talk about compassion satisfaction. Compassion satisfaction protects against secondary trauma. It's a form of building resiliency. Positive benefits received from direct worker contact with vulnerable populations can induce and create more compassion satisfaction. This is something we're really going to need in working with marginalized populations that often overlap with families that are experiencing substance use disorder. Compassion satisfaction includes feelings of pleasure resulting from helping others. Individuals experiencing compassion satisfaction usually report a stronger belief in the importance of their position in helping others. There are useful tools for assessing secondary trauma for yourself or for your team members. One of them is called the Professional Quality of Life Measure. It measures compassion satisfaction versus compassion fatigue, or what was formerly known as burnout. When you help people, you have direct contact with their lives. As you may have found, your compassion for those you help can affect you in positive and negative ways. The questions in this self-assessment are about your experiences, both positive and negative, as a social worker. There are a number of tools and practices you can implement to prevent secondary trauma and to build resiliency. They include things like attending clinical supervision, ongoing training, practicing self-care, balanced caseloads, use of evidence-based practices, psychoeducation, good nutrition and exercise, of course, and self-reporting screening is always a good tool. After you've done a self-assessment or begun to think you might be experiencing secondary trauma, you can begin to think about interventions that you or your team or your supervisor could help implement to divert, to battle, to fight against secondary trauma. Some of those tools include cognitive behavioral therapy, mindfulness, balancing of caseloads, as I mentioned earlier, changes in job assignment potentially. Potentially the work you're doing is causing too much secondary trauma. Make sure you refer to employee assistance programs or other outside resources. Work with your coworkers, work with your supervisor, have meetings and discussions, talk about it. That's a big part of dealing with secondary trauma. Another critical issue to be aware of is compassion fatigue. We used to call compassion fatigue burnout, but now we're bringing more holistic, supportive, resiliency-based language to our work. We know that we're all going to experience compassion fatigue. It's caused by chronic exposure or work with vulnerable populations. As I mentioned earlier, when you're working in the fields of child welfare, especially as it relates to substance use disorder, you're going to be working with a lot of families that are struggling and that are vulnerable and marginalized. Compassion fatigue can cause many things in us. It can be characterized by depersonalization, emotional exhaustion, cynicism, lack of effectiveness, and depletion of emotional resources and personal energy. One of the reasons to really be aware of compassion fatigue is that it can lead to a decrease in our job performance, in our satisfaction with our jobs, in our commitment to our organization and our families. These are natural things to feel, and so let's talk about them, assess them, and address them together. It's also critical we think about this work in light of the pandemic. Clients' needs are increasing as the services they need simultaneously decrease in many sectors. The pandemic has highlighted the impact of racism in medicine and other spaces, which can weigh heavily on many of those we serve. It can weigh heavily on us as well. Feeling the effects of unemployment, illness, and mental health concerns related to the pandemic have all increased and made it much more difficult for the families we work with. While the pandemic has greatly influenced and impacted the families we work with in negative ways, we also know it has greatly impacted us and our work and made it much more difficult to do our jobs. This is not something I need to remind you of. You're experiencing it every day. So let's talk about compassion fatigue and be clear about some of the challenges that we've had to deal with in this really difficult year. One of the ways at DSS we really deal with compassion fatigue is to have a work-life balance. But unlike frontline medical staff or others, we're now working from home. And so any boundaries that we had between work and life have been erased, and that's an incredible challenge. Despite whatever training we've been through, we haven't been trained to work from home via technology tools that are new during a pandemic. These are all new environments that have created new challenges that we haven't been trained in or even been compensated for fully. This is hard. Despite all the trainings that exist out there for trying to work from home, these are all new technologies. This is a new practice. We're working from home during a pandemic. This is not what we were trained for when we went to social work school or any other graduate school. This is a hard time. As we discussed, this pandemic has really exacerbated the crises with the families we're dealing with, whether they're personal crises, political crises, institutional crises. And so we might feel guilty when we have to prioritize our own personal needs, if we need our own work-life balance, if we need our rest. We know that the families we're dealing with are probably struggling with more, but we still have to prioritize the needs that we have. One of the other real challenges from working at home is that in trying to address compassion fatigue, a way to do that is with physical interactions with your coworkers, people you trust, people who respect you. And we haven't had those opportunities to meet with our coworkers, to talk with our coworkers, to debrief these crisis situations that we're dealing with. So we're in really, really hard times here with the pandemic. There are a number of workplace practices we can institute to help reduce compassion fatigue. You can work with your manager, work with your coworkers, and help identify the practices that you think would help you the most. One thing you can talk about as a team is the ability to use flexible or compressed work schedules. How would they work? How would we implement it? What could we do to make everyone feel comfortable? And then as we talk about in our practice, think about trauma-informed care, not only for the clients you work with, of course, but also for yourself. Can you work with your supervisor to ensure that you have a trauma-informed practice, that they're supervising you in a trauma-informed way? There are many trainings and resources out there to support you and your team on these conversations. Related to flexible or compressed work schedules, think about remote work options. Is that something that's possible for your team? Is that even good for your team? You've probably been practicing it this year, but now that we're this far in, it's worth thinking about what's a sustainable option for remote work options. Now let's talk about trauma-informed self-care. I know many of you are deeply familiar with the trauma-informed practice in general, and you also have a growing familiarity with self-care. Now let's talk about combining those two concepts, being trauma-informed as well as self-care. Trauma-informed self-care incorporates a range of practices that help you and your team manage your emotional and personal well-being. There are many trauma-informed trainings related to self-care that exist. They are deeply correlated with increases in compassion satisfaction and decreases in compassion fatigue. One thing also to be aware of related to trauma-informed self-care is that it's a practice. It's something you do every day. You do it as a team, how you communicate with each other, how you support each other, and you also do it one-on-one. It could be one-on-one with your teammates, it could be one-on-one with your supervisor, but thinking about the practice, looking for resources around the practice to ensure that you're implementing trauma-informed self-care is critical. Another key practice to implement related to trauma-informed self-care is support from colleagues, support from a friend. Find people in your life who you can share with, who you can talk with, who you can discuss challenges with. That's a critical aspect of trauma-informed self-care. To truly build a trauma-informed culture at DSS, a lot of this work needs to be led by our supervisors. They need to understand the core competencies, practices, skills, and model the behavior related to being trauma-informed. A key skill for supervisors is to be able to identify the signs, symptoms, and risk factors related to secondary trauma. Supervisors should have knowledge of the employee assistance programs that exist and other services that are out there to support their teams. Supervisors play a key role in modeling trauma-informed practices. They should self-assess for their own secondary trauma, they should monitor it and address it, which will both make them better supervisors and demonstrate to their teams how one can do it. Supervisors can create safe environments where they can share their own traumatic experiences and model what it looks like to share and to create a safe space. Supervisors can model appropriate self-disclosure around traumatic events. That's a good way to show and create a trauma-informed, safe environment. It's critical for supervisors to understand that the personalities and perspectives and worldviews of their teams are going to evolve and change, especially as traumatic events occur or they're experiencing secondary trauma. It's critical to understand that perspectives will evolve and change, and how do you support your team members to do that? There are specialized trainings that exist in child welfare related to being trauma-informed and managing your teams. I'd encourage you to reach out to your regional offices. They have all kinds of resources that can support you in developing your training curricula, especially around being trauma-informed. We do know that specialized training in child welfare leads to higher levels of satisfaction for frontline staff. We also know that specialized training really helps leaders and managers in how to support their teams and how to grow their teams. And we know that staff are less likely to develop feelings of depersonalization if they've been able to attend specialized trainings on being trauma-informed. Let's discuss a few more best practices for supervisors around how to support their teams and lead with more and more self-care. As we've talked about a lot in this training, teams are critically important. So let's continue to meet weekly if possible, bi-weekly if you need to, meet in person face-to-face if you can. Those instances of having places where teams can share and talk and work together are absolutely critical to building up the resiliency of our teams. It's absolutely critical that our teams have times and safe spaces to share about their traumatic experiences, about practices they're implementing around their own self-care. All of these practices contribute to ways that staff can remain connected, especially if we're working more and more virtually or remotely. Creating opportunities where staff can connect, work with each other, share experiences are critically important. And as I'm sure you're doing, continue to express appreciation to your teams for all the work they're doing in this difficult time. Thank you so much for coming today and learning more about worker self-care and secondary trauma. Your work is so critically important to the families of Virginia, particularly those struggling with substance use disorder. It's absolutely critical that you speak up and you understand your own needs so that we can help. We want you to be the strongest and the best you can be so that you can support those families in the state of Virginia. So please reach out to your manager, reach out to your coworkers, reach out to your regional offices, reach out to me. Let's identify the supports you need to be the best you can be to support the families that are struggling in Virginia. Thank you so much for your work.